Thank you so much, Mara. I really appreciate it. And a Chag Sameach, happy Pesach, happy Passover to everyone. I know that we are in the midst of Pesach prep, so I hope that actually, though we're talking about Parashat Tzav, and Parashat Tzav is not related to the direct story of Passover, but given the fact that everything after the book of Exodus, after really the beginning of the book of Exodus to the end, Passover is on everyone's mind because we're on the way all to the land of Canaan. If we're not getting out of Egypt, that there's actually some, I think, an interesting connection with the holidays. So if you haven't yet prepped for your Seder and you're looking for a last minute teaching to be able to bring to your Seder, you can't come to the right place. So I'm looking forward to learning with you. And before I get into the actual Parashat Tzav, I kind of want to lay out the framework for how I want to have this learning discussion together. In the Haggadah, in the book that we use for the Passover Seder, I'm going to say something really provocative right now. The Passover, the Exodus story doesn't appear. It doesn't appear. We have maybe a couple of quotations, but we do not actually have the text from the Pesach story, meaning from the book of Exodus of when the Israelites are actually coming out. And I've always been asked the question, I've always asked the question myself, why don't we just read the story as it appears in Torah? Well, it's a very good answer to that question that we're not going to be dealing with in general in regards to trying to answer that question. However, that particular question and the way in which the Haggadah is designed will give us a framework for our learning of Parashat Tzav and to make the connection between Pesach and Parashat Tzav. So the text that we have in the Haggadah is the very first ritual that appears in all of Torah. And what I mean by first ritual, I mean that the Torah lays out, this is what you do, this is what you will say when you do it, and this is what will happen when it is done. And by ritual, it's not just the ritual where the priest is involved in the temple, but it's the ritual that people do specifically for the holiday, not even just for the holiday Passover, but just for anytime they come up to offer a sacrifice. So that text you can actually will see on your screen. And this is the central text of the Haggadah, which again doesn't appear in the actual story of Pesach. We don't actually have the story of Pesach in the Haggadah. If you take a look, it comes from Deuteronomy, Parashat Ki Tavo. When you enter the land that the Eternal your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil which you harvest from the land that the Eternal your God is giving you. Put it in a basket and go to the place where the Eternal your God will choose to establish the divine name. So go to the land, and now I want you to give thanks for it. Bring your goods, bring everything you have. You shall go to the priest in charge at that time and say to him, I acknowledge this day before the Eternal your God that I've entered the land that God swore to our fathers to assign to us. I'm almost imagining this as like on a bima. It's like, you say this, and now I'm going to respond with this way. The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down in front of the altar of the Eternal your God. And then you shall actually offer this response. You shall then recite as follows before the Eternal your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Eternal, the God of our ancestors, and the Eternal heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents, bringing us to this place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so now I bring of the fruits of the soil that you, O Eternal One, have given me. That's the central story of our Haggadah. And as you can tell, the story of Passover, leaving Egypt, is at the core of this particular passage. But what's key is that this is the ritual. This is what you would do when it came time to the temple. Now, why is it that the Haggadah uses this? two, I think, answers here, especially as I was taught by my professor, Rabbi Dr. Burton Vysotsky from the Jewish Theological Seminary, who's a fabulous teacher and works a lot in early rabbinic teachings, particularly the Mishnah and Midrash. And what he said is that especially at the time that the Seder was drawn up, happened after the life of Jesus, meaning that Jesus' Last Supper was not a Seder. It was a completely rabbinic ritual later on, that the rabbis wanted to do two things. First, they wanted to ensure that their role as rabbis was seen as just as important, if not now more important than the priests, because the temple had been destroyed. And second is that this ritual is actually, this paragraph is the shortest version of the Passover story that you can have, right? One paragraph, people can memorize it. And in fact, if this is what people said when they went up to the temple, there probably was already a tradition of memorizing this passage. So if you want to know the Passover story, remember this passage. It gives it to you kind of in the Cliff Notes version. But what the Haggadah does, and by focusing on this ritual that maybe this saying that people knew, is it then launches into rabbinic midrashic interpretation of this passage. When we sit at the Haggadah table, when we sit at the Seder table reading the Haggadah, we are reading the rabbi's ritual. We are doing the rabbi's ritual. We're not necessarily enacting the actual Exodus. We're enacting the rabbi's decision or the rabbi's way of ritualizing the actual act of the Exodus as a way for us to show fidelity, for us to show loyalty and trust in the rabbinic vision of how to be able to interpret and live a Jewish life as it is going to occur post the destruction of the temple. Now, I want to say that not in a polemical way, one way or the other, but more just in a matter of fact way. You need to have leaders, and leaders will devise rituals that allow for everyone who is participating to feel a sense that they are the right leaders and that they are in the right place. They're at the right place and the right time. So the framework that I'm starting out here is that the Seder is the rabbi's ritual, as seen by this focus the Haggadah on this passage from the book of Deuteronomy as our central Passover story. That relates very much to Parashat Tzav, because in essence, what Parashat Tzav really brings up to the surface in a certain way that is especially understood by virtue of the fact that we are approaching the holiday of Pesach, of Passover, is that the actions that take place in Parashat Tzav, which are the rituals that Aaron and the priest have to do, it's not about Aaron and the priest. It's not about the people of Israel per se. It's about Moses. It's Moses's ritual. And just as the Haggadah or the Seder is a way for the Exodus story to be told through the rabbi's ritual, fidelity and connection to God, which is often how we describe sacrifice or prayer, is seen and understood through fidelity and loyalty to Moses's ritual and to Moses's leadership. We can see that actually, if you take a look at your screen again, let me just get there for a second. Get there again by looking at the very beginning of the Parsha. Okay? Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses saying, Tzav et Aharon ve'epanav lemor. You shall command, this tzivui form. Tzivui is a form that is particularly directive. Do this, act in this way. And it's supposed to be a command, and it's supposed to be very stark. So the command is for Moses to command Aaron. It's not God commanding Aaron. It's Moses commanding Aaron. Now, there are times in Torah when God speaks to Aaron and Moses. So theoretically, if this was Aaron leading the ritual, then we would expect that God is speaking to Aaron and Moses. But it's not that. In fact, it's not even that God is speaking to Aaron. God's only speaking to Moses, and then Moses is doing the act of commanding, almost as if they're receiving their orders from Moses and not from God. Remember that earlier in towards the end of Exodus, that we have the story of the golden calf. One of the ways in which we can think about the story of the golden calf without getting so much into it right now is that the golden calf was a way for the Israelites to replace not God, but Moses. Moses had gone up to the mountain to receive the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. He was gone. No one knew where he was. And they're like, we're leaderless. We don't have somebody to lead us out into the future. And so what do? They turn back to where they were focused on, to their experience in Egypt, where you had these idols, which seemingly was the representative of God, but even more so kind of replaced God in the minds of the people so that they had someone to look at. They had someone that they could hold on to. You know, in our rituals, in our traditions, all of our religious traditions, we have that need for something that is tangible, but we do it in different ways. In Judaism, we have Torah. We have that physical book, which I'm going to share with you in a short while, like how it looks and how that's supposed to kind of represent that idea of we have that something that's physical. In Christianity, the figure of Jesus as an individual who became divine is that sense of here is someone who we can be able to look to as someone who is here. In Islam, it's not the same way as either Judaism or Christianity, but I do remember, I believe it was in the Hagia Sophia I went to in Turkey. We went to one of the mosques, I think it was the Blue Mosque, and I will never forget this incredible, I can't even describe it. It was like a huge, somebody can be describing better in the comments. It wasn't like an earring. It was like just a massive circular object with, in beautiful Arabic calligraphy, the name of God, and just over everyone. And it was so powerful. We need those kind of physical things, but it's the way in which those physical things, they lead us to do what we hope will be the right thing and not the wrong thing. That's the difference between right ritual versus, let's say, idolatry or wrong ritual, which I'm sure if you come back next week talking about wrong ritual in Parashat Shmini, that may be a topic to be brought up. So if you're here with me so far, we've got this idea of a ritual coming from a certain perspective. This ritual of Tzav that comes in Tzav, which has to do with the ordination of Aaron and the priests, is coming from Moses, not from God. Moses, God is saying yes to Moses, do this, but it's physically coming from Moses. And it's almost as if that we want the people, or God wanted the people, to really see Moses as that divine interlocutor and that one who could be the one that people can trust, that they can be loyal to. But what's also so fascinating in this parasha is it doesn't just through this opening moment of Tzav give us a sense that this is Moses's ritual. We can actually kind of see it through some of the details of the ritual themselves. And there are three specific pieces related to the ritual that appears in Tzav that I want to highlight as really emphasizing how this is Moses's ritual, how this is for the people to have faith in Moses and Moses's leadership. That is at the core, that's what at stake here. So if you can, please take a look at your screen. Actually, I already have it on the screen, but I'm going to stop this share. And I'm going to bring up a short little PowerPoint for you to be able to see. Make sure you can all see it this way also. Let's see if you can see that. Mara, can you tell me if you can see it? Do you see no, you see the other one. Do you see the other one? All right, hold on one second. Yeah, let me just stop that.
We see something.
You see something, but it's not the thing I want you to see. So let me try it one more time. And here we are. Okay. So.
Beautiful.
There we go. That's better. All right. First thing we have a mentioning in this parsha of the Urim and Tumim. Vayasem alav et hachoshen, vayten el hachoshen et ha'urim ve'et ha'tumim. He put the breastpiece on him and put into the breastpiece the Urim and Tumim. Now, the Urim and Tumim are these different crystals, these different mineral objects that come from the earth that are precious jewels. And each one of them represents one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Earlier in the book of Exodus, we actually have another description of the Urim and Tumim, particularly as it pertains to how each one of these gems represented one of the tribes of Israel. And that only by virtue of each tribe having their like the diadem kind of put together with the 12 tribes will the Urim and Tumim, which, by the way, the word in terms of Urim, it means light, and Tumim has the sense of, not, I wouldn't say simplicity, kind of like the Tam that appears in the Haggadah of the Seder, but that this is a ritual in which you can plainly see the presence of God. What happens is it's kind of like if you ever see one of those national treasure kind of movies where if you get all of the different gems and you put them in the right order, then something magical is going to happen, a door is going to open up. It almost kind of has that feel to it, where if you have these gems, that God is actually going to be able to speak to whoever is wearing it. Or you look at the Urim and Tumim as a way to be able to be in connection with God. Now, I want you to notice two things from the pictures. The first is that here's an example of a priest wearing the Urim and Tumim on his breastplate. I would argue that the reason why the Urim and Tumim are so important is because when Moses is gone, the people still need a way to be able to connect to God. Remember that, as I said before, the whole issue with the golden calf is that they went the wrong way when Moses wasn't there. So in a certain sense, this, by Moses being the one, right? He put the breastpiece on him. This is Moses. Moses putting the breastpiece on him is to say, I am now giving you the tool so that when I am no longer here, you will have your own way to connect with God. But in a certain sense, the breastpiece, by virtue of it being the Urim and Tumim, is also saying, I will be with you. Moses will continue to be here. I will continue to be able to lead you. So trust the priest's understanding of the Urim and Tumim, because I bestow upon them this particular ritual, this particular ritual object. And we still have that today, meaning we don't have the priests anymore. But if you take a look at the picture above, not every Torah has this, but many Torahs do, where a Torah scroll, right, that physical object that we look at, that we carry, that we walk around the temple, it's not the temple, but the synagogue, or some call it temple. You walk around, you kiss it, and you read from it, and you're very careful with it. You know, we don't have idolatry in Judaism, but somebody could come into a synagogue and be like, that's idolatrous. You're looking at the Torah and treating it as if it's something that is God. It's not. It's a way to get to God. But the way in which it is dressed actually represents what we believe God's presence to look like, to feel like. One is that you have crowns that feel like, that sense, to give that sense that God is king, God is sovereign. Two, you have the fact that it's full of the words of Torah that emanate, that come from God. And three, you have the actual Urim and Tumim. You have the breastplate that's on it, which we think of as mostly having to do with being reminded of what the priest did at the temple, but it's not. It's what Moses bestowed upon the priests. So it's a way to remember Moses's leadership, because this is about Moses's ritual. This is not necessarily about the priest ritual. And by the way, one other way to think about that has to do actually with the next piece. If I can actually get to the right one. Sorry, hold on. Oops. and that is the blood. Now, I was trying to find a better picture for this than just the blood of the Nile. But when you search online for blood, priests being splattered with blood all over them, the internet just goes crazy. And I'm like, I'm not going to go down that route. That's just not a good route to go. But actually, the Nile being covered with blood is important, because one of the other things that's we need to think about when it comes to any ritual is, what is the job that has to be done? What is the job that this ritual is supposed to do for the people who are experiencing it? And I'd argue that the plagues, as much as they are about these wonders and portents, it's also in a certain sense like a ritual. And in fact, we ritualize it during the Seder with the recitation of Dam, Tzvardeya, Kinim, Arov, blood, frogs, all of those different plagues. We take out the wine with our fingertips and we put it on the plate. We say it's because we're sad by the fact that the Egyptians were destroyed. It may not be that. Here's my thought on it. My thought is that the reason why we take the finger out, we put the finger into the wine and take it out each time we do a plague, is one, to reminisce about this particular plague, the plague of blood coming into the Nile, that it's the first one that appears. Wine kind of looks a little bit like blood, and so therefore it's almost bringing that piece into it. But even more so, that halakhically, according to Jewish law, there is an idea called bracha over la'asiyatan, that a blessing can only be enacted or can only occur once you do an action. So whether it's from eating challah, as an example, you can't eat challah and then recite the blessing. You have to recite the blessing and then eat the challah. But if you just eat the challah or just recite the blessing, nothing happens. It doesn't do the job. So you say Dam, you put your finger in, and then you take it out. In order to enact this ritual, you have to do an action with it. So it may not be that it's all about our feelings regarding the Egyptians who died. It may just be about the ritual itself. So why is that so significant? It's so significant because many of the plagues were designed, the ritual, the job that they were supposed to do was to show that God was able to be better than and to destroy, or even just to annul the power of all of the other Egyptian gods. Most of the plagues have some connection to an Egyptian god, whether it's the firstborn, death of the firstborn and Pharaoh, whether it's darkness and the Egyptian god of Ra, whether it is the disease, the cattle disease, which had to do with the fact that cattle were seen as holy in Egyptian tradition, which is why we were not allowed to do animal sacrifices in Egypt, and hence that we wanted to leave Egypt so that we could go worship God by offering a sacrifice outside of Egypt. The first plague has to do with blood, because blood is the essence of life. The Nile and the god of the Nile who provided the water is the essence of life as well for the Egyptians, and in fact for humans in general. One of the definitions of Mitzrayim, of Egypt in Hebrew, or I should say not one of the definitions, the root word of Mitzrayim, of Egypt in Hebrew, is tsar. Tsar has a connotation of trouble, of that we are in like a very bad place. But tsar literally means narrow. So why was Mitzrayim called narrow? Probably because the only life that could occur in all of Egypt, which is mostly desert, is just along the banks of the Nile, a very narrow corridor where life can occur. And that life is signaled by the water that is provided through the Nile. So the water that provided life to everyone provided life to everyone in Egypt, God says that doesn't bring life anymore. That doesn't bring life anymore. Blood represents life, and I'm bringing the blood to replace this water. So when we come to the ritual, to Moses's ritual, in Parashat Tzav, take a look at what it says here from Leviticus 8:24. Moses then brought forward the sons of Aaron and put some of the blood of the sacrifice on the ridges of their right ears and the thumbs of their right hands and on the big toes of their right feet. And the rest of the blood Moses dashed against every side of the altar. Okay. Why are the priests the only ones who get dashed with the blood? Or if we put it another way, if the priest's job is to become holy and then to do a ritual act to make everybody else in all of Israel holy, that is, you prepare, you get yourself ready, and then you go and do the act of the ritual. So you purify yourself and then you purify the people. Was Moses purified before he did this? You can answer in the comments and maybe Mara can tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think so. I don't think so. Moses didn't purify himself. Moses is the one doing the purification without being purified prior to it, which means he didn't need to be purified. He didn't need to be purified because the whole point of the blood, especially thinking about that context of the blood in the Nile from the plague earlier, is to say that the one who brings the blood is the one to whom we will show loyalty and whose power it is that we are aware of here. Moses is conferring power upon Aaron and all of the priests for them to be able to do the job of leading the sacrificial cult. And so by virtue of Moses being this one who doesn't necessarily need to purify himself, it's almost as if we're saying, Moses is our leader. Moses is the one we must trust. None of us really talk to God. So let's let Moses be the one to take the lead. By the way, another kind of just interesting point regarding the connection between blood and water. Water we drink. If we don't have it, we're not allowed to, we can't survive. Blood, according to Torah, we're not allowed to consume at all. It is the essence of life, which is why kosher salt is so popular, because both for kosher food and halal food, it needs to have all of the blood removed from it. And therefore, kosher salt is called kosher just because it does the job of removing the blood, so we don't eat it. But Moses is placing the blood upon the priests. Obviously, they're not consuming it, but it's another way of using the essence of life to say that by sprinkling this blood in this manner, I am conferring. By I am talking about here, I am conferring that you are now ready to take on the work that is to follow God's commands through my actions. Through my actions. So we first have the Urim and Tumim, what happens when Moses is not there. We have the blood, which has to do with Moses's role right there in that moment. And then finally, we get to one of my favorite examples of this, and it has to do with something that we're all going to enjoy during our Passover Seder, or maybe enjoy is a tough word for it. And that is matzah. Oh, matzah. You know, I remember from growing up in school, learning that matzah was the bread that the Israelites ate because they had to rush out of Egypt. They had no chance to bake any other food. And therefore, it is supposed to represent our slavery, but also our freedom from slavery that God was able to, that God did for us, to understand the miracles that God did for us. Fine, that is true, but that's only an interpretation of matzah, interpretation that appears in the book of Deuteronomy. If you subscribe to Documentary Hypothesis, then you'll know that the book of Deuteronomy is not just about a particular interpretation from Moses about all the events that occurred earlier, but that it's actually a rereading, almost a midrash in and of itself, of the story of Exodus. And in Deuteronomy, we get the teaching that you ate the matzah because we had to rush out of the land of Egypt. But in the book of Exodus, we don't. Take a look at Leviticus chapter 8, verse 2. Take Aaron along with his sons and the vestments, the anointing oil, the bowl of purification, the 2 rams, and the basket of unleavened bread. The basket of unleavened bread, which, okay, fine, that makes sense. But, and I just forgot to add this here, so I'm going to take off my screen for a second and share with you once I bring this up. It is not the only kind of bread. It is not the only kind of bread that is used during this ritual of the sacrificial offering in Parashat Tzav. In fact, if I'm able to find it very quickly, I think you're going to be a little bit surprised, right? You're going to be a little bit surprised that in addition to the bread, the unleavened bread, and again, we're talking about being in the desert. So if they didn't have time to make any bread in the desert, how are they going to have time? How are they going to have time to, if they didn't have time to make bread in Egypt, they're going to have time to make bread in the desert? I mean, I'm not a chef, I'm not a cook, but how are they going to be able to really bake something like that? I don't get how bread could be made. And yet, if now you take a look at on your screen, in chapter 7, it's not the only time it is mentioned. What else do they take? They don't just take the matzah, al chalot lechem chametz. The Yis offering with cakes of leavened bread are added. And let me just see if there's, and we have another one. Let's see. Going to bread. That's unleavened bread in 2. And then in verse 26, you actually have it even clear here. From the basket of unleavened bread that was before God, he took 1 cake of unleavened bread, 1 cake of oil bread. Okay. So there's other different kinds of bread around, meaning that there was such bread that it wasn't just about leaving Egypt. It's that matzah actually means something else. And here's what matzah seemingly means. And you have to go all the way back to the book of Exodus. Sorry, not the book of Exodus. You have to go all the way back. So I'm just jumping between 2 different presentations, so I apologize. You have to jump back to the book of, I'm just going to do it this way because that's not working. You have to jump back. That's okay. You have to jump back to the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 19, verse 3. Chapter 19 is a story of Sodom and Gomorrah when the angels came down to tell Lot to get out of Sodom and Gomorrah. They had to be saved because God was about to destroy the land. And, which you probably can't see it this well over here. Let me bring it up this way. It says, when the angels came down, Lot invited them in. And Lot invited them in to a meal. Verse 3, but he urged them strongly, so they turned his way and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread and ate. All right. One way to determine meanings of words in Hebrew, especially when we think about the fact that they did not have a dictionary, right? There was no English, there was no Aramaic, there was no dictionary to whatever language they had. Okay, you have to learn it by context. So 2 different words there, and I kind of took it off the screen just because I was having issues with the presentation. But the word right before matzah is the word mishteh. So they had a mishteh of matzah. Mishteh means a feast. We know that from the story of Purim. That Purim has 4 different mitzvot: Mikra Megillah, reading of the Megillah; Mishloach Manot, giving of gifts to our friends and neighbors; Matanot le'evyonim, giving gifts to the poor; and Mishteh, having a feast. So what's matzah? Matzah's a feast. Matzah's a feast. That's why it's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Chag HaMatzot. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the story of the Exodus. So why do we then have the interpretation of it being part of the story of the Exodus? Well, if we think about it, in this particular ritual of Parashat Tzav, having to do with the ordination of the priests and bringing together everyone, you have this matzah, which is not just a food that is part of a feast anymore. It is now used for a ritual purpose. And what is that ritual purpose? It is to remind us of the Exodus in which Moses was our leader taking us out. So that every time we eat matzah, and we do this today, right? We could have matzah as a feast But anytime you buy matzah, it's like, oh, I'm not going to buy matzah except for Pesach. Like, why would I want to eat that? I mean, you can make a good cracker. Like, I don't mind like matzah, cream cheese, and jelly like any time of the year. But yes, it's not necessarily my favorite, but we think about it as unleavened bread that has to do with the Pesach, with Passover, with this moment. And that's all because of Moses's role. Moses is the one ordaining this moment in order for it to occur, whereby the matzah and the other bread are used together. Because that's the key part here. It's not just that we have matzah being used, it's that by virtue of this particular ordination that appears in Parashat Tzav, we also have the fact that there are other breads being used as part of the normal ritual that goes on. But by virtue of bringing in the unleavened bread, we understand that it also has to do with this Exodus, with what Moses did for our people. So we got three things, right? Three things in regards to seeing how this is the ritual of Moses. One, we had this notion of the Urim and Tumim. What happens when Moses dies and Moses no longer here? Two, we have this idea of the blood, that it is actually Moses spraying it. He doesn't need to be sprayed by the purity of the blood. He's the one who's doing it, and we're showing our faith in him, in his leadership. And three, we have the matzah, because every time we eat the matzah, every time we do a ritual of the matzah, we're remembering what Moses did for us. What Moses did for us. And if you want to just to bring it home, I want to go to the very last verse of Parashat Tzav. So one other thing we have to keep in mind, by the way, is like, how do we get the parshiot? How do we get the different chapters? 1 second, I can't seem to get this out of my hair over here. How do we have the different parshiot? Like, why don't we just continue on, like have different breaks? And by the way, that is very true when it comes to Parashat Tzav, insofar as it's a little bit unclear as to why we should end this Torah portion where we do and not continue on into what is Parashat Shmini. Because if you take a look at the very beginning of Parashat Shmini, it says right here, very first verse of chapter 9. Okay, remember, if you open up a Torah, it doesn't have chapters and verses, which always screws up any mitzvah kids. They're like, why isn't it? Why can't they just have like chapters and verses? It's easier for me to find. Chapter 9, verse 1. Vayhi bayom hashmini kara Moshe le'aron uvanav ziknei Yisrael. On the 8th day, Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. The 8th day, but the 8th day of what? If you're going to say 8th, it means that there were things that came before it. It's not just on this first day, at this particular time. It's a part of a succession. So you can't, like, I'll put it this way. If I wrote a paper and I started by saying, and on the 8th day, my teacher would be like, and what happened beforehand? Right? It doesn't make sense to start a parsha right here. But maybe there's a reason why. Maybe there's a reason why we end the parsha where we do, and we start by Vayhi bayom hashmini where we do. Remember at the beginning, I said that the very first verse or second verse of the parsha, it said, Tzav et Aharon ve'banav, where God called to Moses, Vaydaber Adonai Moshe lemor, Tzav et Aharon uvanav. God called to Moses and said, command Aaron and his sons in this offering. At the very end of Parashat Tzav, we have another example of the word Tzav. Vayas Aharon uvanav et kol hadvarim asher tziva Adonai. Now, this could theoretically undermine my whole thesis about this particular teaching, is that it had to do with Moses and not necessarily about God, about trust in Moses' leadership, not necessarily about God's leadership, because here it says, this is what God commanded. Except it doesn't end there. It says, last two lines, Beyad Moshe. Only through Moses' hand. It's like that emphasis, right? Final emphasis. Yes, we're getting God's word, but it's done through the perspective, the ritual of Moses. When we sit down for Pesach, we are not reading the Passover story. We're reading the Passover story through the eyes of the rabbis and who designed the Seder with the Haggadah in mind so we could have trust and be in them and be loyal to them as the Jewish people. This Parashat, a Parashat Tzav, is not a ritual for God. It is a ritual for God that is done through the perspective of having loyalty specifically to Moses. And the fact that it says Biyad Moshe, let's not take that and just throw it to the side. By the hand of Moses, literally his hands spraying the blood upon the priests, leading them in this ritual, doing the action. Remember what it said in the end of Deuteronomy 26 when we were talking about that particular ritual that we will recite at the Haggadah, at the Seder? It says, Vayotzienu Adonai mimitzrayim beyad chazaka uvizroa netuya uvmora gadol uvotot uvmoftim. It is through the hand of God that we were able to become free. The hand of God, the hand of Moses. Here, they're almost identical. They're not just necessarily one leads to the other. It's that it's almost like the same hand. And the final example of that, I'm not going to bring up on the screen, but just when we get to the seventh day of Pesach and we read the story of the Exodus of Egypt and with Parashat Bishalach, the crossing of the Red Sea, just pay attention to the introduction. Vayosha Adonai bayom ahu et Yisrael mi'Mitzrayim, vayar Yisrael yad adola asher asa Adonai b'Mitzrayim, vayaru ha'am et Adonai, vayaminu b'Adonai uv Moshe avdo. At that moment, all of Israel saw what God did, saw God's hand at work, and by virtue of seeing God's hand at work, they didn't just have faith in God, they also had faith in Moses. And with that, I can stop.
Wow, you just left us with some really large theological questions. And so I want to hear from Susan and Arnold. I don't know, Rabbi, if you have a hard stop. I imagine you might have to go soon.
I can take a couple extra minutes. So if people want to,
if
you stayed with us, I'm happy to. Yeah.
My first thing in terms of Moses, and you said he wasn't purified. He was, he didn't need a purification process. He already was. That feels a little bit radical to me in terms of and comparing God's hand to Moshe's hand. It almost feels you were talking about idolatry. How can we hold sort of reverence for Moshe in a way that doesn't put him at God's level? That's my question. And I don't know if we want to group that in with
why don't we group it into all the questions and see.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I'm not sure if it's Susan or Doug, but I see your hand raised.
Thank you very much. That's all very interesting, and I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. You're in 2 points. You're trying to elevate our understanding of Moses, but when Moses hands off these rituals to the priests, when the priests do them, are the people supposed to be thinking of Moses? Number one. And number two, if Moses is so important, why isn't he allowed to go into or his offspring allowed to go into the promised land, whereas Aaron's sons are the ones who are going to carry on these rituals?
Great. Happy to answer those as part of it.
And we'll go to Arnold.
So it's a similar point. Why, if it's Moses is so important, why is he traditionally not mentioned in the Haggadah?
So Arnold, I want to start with yours. All right. So can I actually give a little bit of a dialogue here? Try to answer your own question. Part of my thesis is that it's not just about the ritual of Pesach or ritual of Seder. It's who are we loyal to? Who do we trust? So why would Moses not be written in a book composed by rabbis? Because the rabbis are saying, there ain't any more Moses around. You need us. We are the ones who can help lead you into the future. We do rabbinic Judaism. We don't do ancient Judaism. And by the way, that's an important thing to raise, especially in regards to the points that Doug, you were making. So Doug, you were saying the first point was that they're supposed to remember Moses with the Urim and Tumim. My answer is yes. That's part of the point here. We think it's about the priest, but really it's about remembering Moses, because if you take this parasha and that it was Moses who bestowed the Urim and Tumim upon them, yeah, it's through his power. It's through his power that is what we're supposed to remember and what they're supposed to draw upon when they're leading everybody in the cult. And even more so, again, similar point. Why is it that I'm going to use a different religious story here, but by the way, if you take a look at the New Testament, you'll see that there's a lot of similarities between the characters of Jesus and Moses as they're written, even from their birth, that Jesus was born and then had to leave because Herod wanted to kill all the firstborn children in Bethlehem due to who was actually born there. And he had to then escape to Egypt. From the very beginning, there's like a comparison between these two figures. So part of the Passover story, or I should say not part of the Passover story, but that Jesus's example of his particular, the way in which he did Judaism back then, because he lived fully as a Jew. He did the Passover sacrifice, and then he had that dinner that often called the Last Supper. Afterwards, that leads directly to the holiday of Easter. And what happens at Easter? He disappears. He's gone. He's not there. He doesn't have any children. So he's not necessarily supposed to be able to have anyone who's exactly going to follow him. And also, by the way, even thinking about in Islam, when in regards to Muhammad, the traditions that Islam is based off of, and I don't know these too well right now, but that you had two individuals who were fighting for the people to follow them because he did not have anyone specifically to really give the reins to. The problem with having leaders that then spire off leaders afterwards is that you lose the connection to the symbol of that original leader. So Dafka, it's because his children were not really brought into the land. Dafka, it's because God buried Moses. We have no idea where Moses is buried. The people didn't do it. It's Dafka because of those instances that it brings up the point even more so of how important Moses is. And that leads me to Mara, to your question, to your point here. Look, let me back up for a second. There is a theologian who kind of mixes his own Christian interpretation together with Eastern philosophy together. His name is Alan Watts. He was in the 1970s. Some of you may have read his book. Or his writings. One of his books is one of my favorites, called The Wisdom of Anxiety. And it talks a lot, actually, at the beginning, about faith, about belief, and talking about like, what is it that gives us anxiety? It's when we don't know how to move forward, when we don't trust what is it that we can't see. And he talks about this in regards to the religious imagination as the difference between belief and faith. Between belief and faith. Belief is something that you want to hold on to, that you cleave to, that if the Exodus didn't happen, then all of Judaism is like done for. Then like there's no point to any and all of this. That's what belief does, because we have to cling to it so much. But that true faith is actually letting go of that sense of belief, of letting go of that thing that we feel like we have to hold on to so much, because faith lets go, whereas belief clings. Belief makes us hold on to something. And any of the things that we do as humans when it comes to our religious connection, that's in the realm of belief, because we do things, we do these actions, we do these rituals to teach us something, and they have to mean something. We have to believe that they are true. But then the question of idolatry comes in as to whether or not we're actually just doing these things, just believing in them for their own sake and not for what it is that they're trying to get us to do. And that's where Alan Watts talks about the difference between belief and faith in this metaphor. Belief is like sucking your thumb that is pointing in the right direction, meaning you're not seeing where your thumb or your finger is pointing to. That's what belief is supposed to do. Instead, you suck it for comfort like a child. That if you hold on to this ritual in such a clenched way, it's almost as if we don't have any faith, because faith lets go of those things that whether we can't prove, we argue about, but it still retains at the core that understanding that we have something to look forward to. We have something to be able to hold on to as a symbol. And in that way, I actually think that the fact that Moses is being raised to this level is important, because on one hand, it is saying when these rituals happen, I want you to know that when I'm doing this, God's doing this. I am the true representative of God here. And that by virtue of you believing in me, you're believing in God. But then by virtue of in this parasha, adding the Urim and Tumim is saying that one day when you're not around, I want you to be able to hold these things almost as that gift that I've given you. That one day you're going to be having a Seder, which I don't necessarily know about, that I have, and that you have matzah that you're going to be eating. And it's to remember what God did through my hands to be able to make you free. It's that kind of faith of holding me up as a symbol, but because I am no longer here, you can no longer suck your thumb for comfort by virtue of the fact that I'm still alive. And you have to figure out your own rituals that you're going to make happen. One final thing on this little story to kind of wrap up. It's maybe a way to think of the famous midrash that Moses was up on Mount Sinai with God writing the Torah and was writing the different jots and tittles on the top of all the letters. And God said, I don't know. Like Moses said, what do these mean? I have no idea what they mean. And God said, well, it's because one day there will be someone who will interpret these things that you wrote as something I passed down to you, that you had this knowledge and you were able to allow this knowledge to be learned in a different generation. And Moses was like, that's really cool. Can I see it? And then all of a sudden, God whisks Moses away to the back of Rabbi Akiva's classroom, where Rabbi Akiva was explaining those jots and tittles. And you know what he said? Where do we get this? Halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Halacha that we got from Moshe at Mount Sinai. And Moses was like, wow, I never knew I was that smart. Right? We'd have these symbols. They mean something in the moment, but sometimes those moments pass and we have to be able to adjust. We don't forget where we came from, but we have to be able to adjust in a way that keeps the heart of what those symbols are about and allows us to retain that greater faith. Because ultimately, the story of Pesach is a story of finding faith in the midst of darkness, of finding hope in the midst of hopelessness, and finding openness in the midst of tsar, in the midst of narrowness. And with that, I want to wish everyone Shabbat
thank
Shalom
you
and Chag
so
Sameach.
much for your extra time. Thank you all. Wishing you Shabbat Shalom, Chag Pesach Sameach, and we will see you next week. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Shabbat Shalom.